Hi, my name is David. I'm a developer at Sketch Development. In this webinar, I'm going to show you how to create a purpose-built AI assistant using the new OpenAI Assistance API. But first, what is an AI assistant? Simply, an AI assistant is a software application that uses artificial intelligence to assist users in performing tasks or answering questions or managing information. And any good AI assistant should have the following attributes. The first is natural language processing. It needs the ability to understand and respond to human language. Next is information retrieval. It should be able to quickly search for and present information, whether it finds it on the web or through documents that you've uploaded to the assistant or even other data sources. Third is learning capabilities. So over time, the AI assistant should learn from interactions and become more personalized and more efficient. Next is tool integration. If you want your AI to do more than just respond with text, you need to integrate it with different tools or APIs so it can perform tasks on your behalf. And finally is problem solving or dynamic problem solving. So if presented with a difficult question or a complicated math problem, the AI should be able to create a multi-step execution plan or maybe even write its own code to come up with a solution to the problem. And there are thousands of use cases for AI assistants. Here's just a few to help you guys think how you can use an AI assistant in your organization. The first is customer support. This could be a chatbot that responds to customer questions or complaints and provides 24/7 support on your website. Next is content generation. You may have seen these already. There's AIs out there that can assist in writing articles, blog posts, social media updates, even marketing copy. Next is educational tools. Khan Academy recently released an AI that helps teachers create the curriculum for their classes, but it also acts as a personalized tutor for the students. Next is financial analysis. You can imagine an AI that you feed tons of financial data to, be it annual reports or news articles or press releases, even stock market data, and it can use that data to provide investment insights or recommendations. E-commerce, you could provide product recommendations that assist with order tracking or maybe even manage a virtual storefront. And then finally, supply chain management. You could monitor inventory levels in real time, use data feeds to predict the demand, and maybe even automate the reordering process to ensure you're always have the right level of inventory. So next, let's look at the OpenAI Assistance API and see how we can use it to build AI assistants with many of the features that we just talked about. The Assistance API, it's built by OpenAI. That's the company behind ChatGPT. And OpenAI was really one of the pioneering organizations in leveraging large language models for generative AI. And the Assistance API, it's currently in beta. I think it was released in November of 2023. It provides the APIs that you need to create your purpose-built AI, has API endpoints for your AI conversational capabilities. It has tool integrations, and it also has everything you need to integrate it into your new or existing applications. And I wanted to point out that even though everything I review today is going to be specific to OpenAI and their documentation and their endpoints, if you are using Azure as your cloud provider, they also offer an OpenAI assistance, they're calling it Preview in their cloud, that has a one-to-one mapping. It's exactly the same endpoints that we'll be walking through today. And they've added some additional things like some enhanced privacy and security and some enhanced content filtering capabilities just to make sure everything is safe for work and maybe a little bit more enterprise ready. So that's an option if you're using Microsoft Azure. So this diagram shows like a high-level structure of an AI assistant. Central is the concept of an assistant. So that's the first thing you do is you create your assistant, and then you configure it with different features and tools. So the first configuration is your LLM, or your large language model, and you can choose from a number of different OpenAI models. Some models are larger and more accurate, but they're also usually slower and more costly. Other models are smaller and faster, and usually cheaper, but they may be less accurate and maybe only suitable for less complicated use cases. OpenAI recommends optimizing for accuracy first, and then optimizing for cost and speed second when it comes to selecting your LLM. I'm not going to go over how to do that here, but there is a guide in the OpenAI documentation that walks you through optimization for your LLM. In this webinar, we're going to use GPT-4o, but I should mention it's really easy to swap models out of your assistants and see how different ones work and which one is best for your use case. So after you select your large language model, you can configure 3 tools. First is file search. So this allows you to upload documentation that's specific to your AI, and it's a way of augmenting the large language model with extra data that the model probably wasn't trained on. Next is function calling. This allows you to define APIs that your assistant can call to perform tasks or retrieve information in real time. Next is the code interpreter. This tool allows the AI to write its own Python code and run it in a sandbox environment. So it's useful for maybe math problems or use cases where you want to parse large amounts of data. And finally is persistent threads. This isn't a tool, but it's more of a feature. This allows you to have a long-running conversation with an AI and allows the AI to remember the context of that conversation. So a little bit deeper dive on a few of these tools. First, the file search. Like I said, it's a way of augmenting the large language model with data that's specific to your AI. So if it's an AI you're building to support like maybe an application, you can upload all the documentation about that application. It could be user guides or troubleshooting guides, anything like that. Right now, you can hold up to 10,000 files per assistant with a maximum file size of 512 megabytes per file. The second tool is function calling. To use function calling, you just describe the functions that the AI has access to using like a JSON format and just plain text description of what the function does. And then the assistant like intelligently knows when it needs to call those functions to perform a task or return data. Like I should point out that the function doesn't, or the assistant doesn't call the function directly. Instead, it asks you to call it for the assistant. So if you ask the assistant a question, it determines it needs to call a function to return some extra data. It'll ask you to call the function, you call the function, get the data and return it back to the assistant, and then it comes back with the answer. And then the third is code interpreter. Like I said, it's just a sandbox environment in OpenAI to run Python code. The assistant is smart enough to know if the code it wrote didn't work the first time, it'll rewrite it and try again. And like I said, it's useful for math problems, or maybe you have a huge data set, like a CSV that you need to turn into a chart or a graph or summarize. Code interpreter is good for things like that. One more thing I want to point out is like these things are all very powerful independently, but the AI can use them together. Like on a single call, it might do a file search and then call a function to perform a task, or maybe return some real-time data, and then take that data and use the code interpreter to parse it or turn it into a chart. So powerful independently, but also really powerful when these things are used together. All right, one more slide before we dive into the hands-on portion of the webinar. I just wanted to go over some concepts and terminology that are used by the Assistance API, so things will make more sense when we start walking through the code. The first concept is, or object, is an assistant. So this is the purpose-built AI that uses the OpenAI models like GPT-4o and can call your tools like file search or function calling. The next concept is a thread. So this is a conversation session between an assistant and a user, and threads store messages and they automatically handle truncation to fit into the context, into the model's context. So this is kind of powerful. Like older APIs, like the Chat Completions API, didn't have this concept of a thread. You had to manage the thread on your own, which meant sending all of the messages back and forth to their API every time you had a question. Also, the models have a certain limit of how long a certain conversation can be. This is their context that they're talking about here. So before the Assistance API, you had to understand how large the context was for the model you're using and handle truncation yourself. Now that's handled by the Assistance API. The third concept is a message. So a message can be created by an assistant or by a user. It can include text or images or other files you upload. And then the message is stored as a list on the thread, and it's stored in chronological order. The third concept the fourth is a run. So this is an invocation of an assistant on a thread. So you create an assistant and you configure it with your model and your tools. Then you create a thread and you'll add a message to that thread. Usually starts with a message from the user. And then those two things, you create a run with your assistant and your thread. And that's where the assistant knows it needs to read through the messages in that thread, look at what tools it has available to it, come up with a plan, and then return a response to the user. And its response is another message that's added to that thread, and that's a message from the assistant. And the last thing here is a run step. Detailed list of steps the assistant took as part of a run. So these are things we usually don't have to worry about, but if you're curious how an AI got to its answer, you can look at the run steps that were taken to produce the result.
It's no secret that not all software developers are created equal. Sure, many can produce line after line of code, but Sketch's engineers are dedicated to achieving the outcomes that you're after in a manner that's both reliable and resilient. We aren't just task-taking coders. We are teams of feedback-obsessed solution crafters dedicated to discovering and building the best possible product. We don't lock you in with a fixed spec, and we won't penalize you for every pivot you'd like to make, because we know you can't possibly have all your best ideas at the start. Sketch delivers iteratively because continuous feedback and changing priorities are the key to building a great product. Skeptical? Give us a call to find out what a full stack development team truly means. We're excited to help bring your vision to life.
Okay, now that we've walked through like all the features and concepts behind the Assistance API, I'm now going to walk you through like step by step how to create an assistant. So the first thing we need to do to create our assistant is to go to openai.com, create an account if we don't have one, sign in, and then create an API key. So I'm going to go to openai.com. And under products, you'll see API login. Now I'm already logged in, but if I wasn't, I would see your standard sign-in screen with an option to create an account if I didn't have one. Once you've created an account and signed in, you'll see a screen like this. Then you can go to the API view. And from here, you'll go to Dashboard. And on the left, you'll see API keys. So I'm going to start by creating a new API key. When you create it, there's a few options. It can be owned by you, or if you're working for a company, you'll typically create a service account that is owned by the service account. This is just my personal account, so I'm going to have it owned by me. You can give it a name. I'm going to call it Webinar Key. You can organize it under different projects. There's also some permissions where you can restrict it to certain endpoints or make it read-only, but for this webinar, I'm going to make it all permissions. And then create the secret key, and it will generate a long random string of characters for you. This is the only time you'll ever be able to see it, so make sure you copy it and save it somewhere. For now, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it into a environment variable in my code here. And while I'm here, I'm going to copy this prompt, which we'll use later. And I'm going to go back. So I copied it, saved it as an environment variable in my code, and I'm done. So we have an API key we can use to call our APIs with. I wanted to show something else while I'm here. There's an assistance tab on your dashboard. This shows all of the assistants that you've created. You can create a new assistant from here and test it out. So even without writing any code, you can go to a playground to test out a new assistant. So let's call this test assistant. We're going to give it some instructions. The example we'll be going through today is an application that is for financial analysts. So the instructions I'm giving the assistant says, you are a financial analyst specializing in company evaluations. You provide insight and recommendations based on provided reports. Explain your reasoning clearly. Give specific figures where relevant to support your conclusions. The instructions are important. It tells the assistant how it should behave. Typically, I'll give it a persona and a few details on how it should respond, and then I'll test it out to see what sort of responses I'm getting back. If the responses are too long, then I'll update the instructions to ask the assistant to be more concise. If the responses are too simple, then I'll update and ask it to respond as an expert. So it's an important way for you to get the assistant to behave how you want. Next is the model. We're going to stick with GPT-4o, but you can see there's a lot of other options here. The two main recommendations now are 4o or 4o mini. Then there's tools. Let's enable file search and add a file that it can search against. So I'm going to upload a file. This is the most recent Apple 10K annual report. So 80-page PDF full of financial data about Apple. I'm going to attach that to the assistant. You see it's creating the vector store and attaching that document to it. You can also enable code interpreter. You can add functions here. These two options, temperature and top P, are two different ways to control how random the responses are. So the higher the temperature, the higher the top P, like the more random and more creative responses you'll get back, the less deterministic. The lower temperature, lower top P, the less deterministic, more consistent your responses will be. So usually if you're doing something creative, you'll go with a higher temperature. If you're doing something that you want consistent responses back, then you'll go with the lower temperature. So I've created the assistant. There's a playground link here where you can actually test it out as well. So I'm going to go here. Here's my financial analyst, and I'll ask it a question. Can you tell me who is on board at Apple? So you can see it created a thread for us. It posted my message, and now the assistant is responding with the current board members. It even gives us a little annotation saying it found this data in our apple.pdf that we just uploaded. So this is a great way to test out different assistants, do maybe some proof of concepts, to tweak your instructions in the playground. So in a few minutes, you've already created a simple assistant that has file search capabilities and can pull data from any file that you upload to it. I'm going to go back to our presentation. We've created our API key. I showed you the playground where you can test out assistants that you've created. Next, we'll be doing some live coding where we'll create the assistant using code instead of the playground screen. And then I'll update a chatbot in an application that we have created already to use this new AI assistant. And then we're going to implement function calling. And then finally, I'll show you how streaming works with the chatbot. I don't think we'll have time to walk through all the code for that, but I'll just show you an example of what that looks like. Before we get started, just want to open up a couple links here. One is the API documentation, and then the API reference. So this is a general how to use the API page from OpenAI. The reference has more details about the endpoints, how to form your request, what the responses look like. So we'll be going back and forth with this documentation as we're doing our coding example. So let's look at the code. We have an application here called Finley. Finley's a SvelteKit application. SvelteKit is just a full stack framework for writing Node applications. I'm going to rerun it. It's running now on port 5173. So I go here, you can see it says Finley is your financial research companion. You can enter a ticker symbol and hit research. It returns through some API calls, some analyst ratings, the stock price, the earnings estimates per share, and then on the right is the annual report, which is, again, that huge document full of all sorts of data about Apple. And on the right here, you can see there's a little chatbot. You can ask it some simple questions like, what is the current stock price? And it pulls back the current stock price from an API call. What is the average earnings? You can give us an average earnings estimate. And if I ask it something more complicated, what are the biggest risks facing Apple? It says, I don't know that. What do you think I am in AI? So very basic chatbot, definitely no AI capability here. So the first thing we need to do is create our AI using code. I'm going to go back. Actually, first I'm going to look here in the documentation. There's an overview. OpenAI provides an SDK for their APIs. They have a Node version and a Python version. There's a .NET version in beta. There's also a number of open source projects that have created versions in other languages. Today we'll be using the Node version. And in the documentation here, it walks you through, in this quick start guide, how you can use that SDK to create an assistant, create a thread, add a message to a thread, and create a run. It also has details on the tools, like file search, so how to create an assistant using file search, and how to create a vector store, upload your documents to the vector store, update the assistants to use this new vector store. So we'll kind of be going back and forth between my code and this reference documentation. So if we wanted to create an assistant, we would do that just using an HTML form, which I've already sort of scripted out here. So there's a route called admin/create assistant. It has a front end, which is a simple form. The form does a post, and it's a multi-part form data because we're going to send files with this form as well. And it has a few fields. It has the name of the assistant, the instructions that we're passing to the assistant, and any uploads that we want to, our files we want to upload to the assistant, and then a submit button. And then this goes to a backend service, and the backend service takes that action from the form, pulls out the data, the name, the instructions, and the uploads, which is an array of files. And then we're going to use OpenAI to create our assistant. So first, let's just look at the form, see what it looks like. So if I go to our application and go to admin/create assistant, you can see, yep, there's a form here, but the back end isn't working yet. So let's implement the back end of this form. First thing I need to do is install the OpenAI SDK. So since this is a Node app, I can just do an npm install OpenAI from my terminal prompt. So it updated my package.json. You can see there's a new OpenAI package there. And going back to our create assistant code, here's the front end, here's the back end. First thing we'll do is import OpenAI from OpenAI, and then we're going to create an instance of this OpenAI class. So we'll say const OpenAI equals new instance of OpenAI, and then we're going to pass it the API key. This was the API key we just created, and we're passing that from an environment variable. And after we've created an instance of our OpenAI class, then we need to create our assistant. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to call OpenAI.beta.assistants.create. That's going to create the assistant with the name that we got from the form, the instructions we got from that web form. We're going to implement the file search tool. You can also here implement other tools like code interpreter or function calling. And then we're going to set the model, and we're going to use GPT-4o. And after we're done, we're just going to print out the ID of this new assistant we just created in OpenAI. So that'll create the assistant, and it'll set the model and define the tools, but it hasn't uploaded the files to it yet. So to do that, we have a block of code here. I'm going to walk through this. We're first just checking to make sure the user uploaded some files through the form. And if they did, then we're going to create a new vector store. So we're going to call the OpenAI class.beta.vectorstore.create, and we're going to provide it with a name. So that's going to create our new vector store. And then we're going to call this function to upload our files to that vector store. So OpenAI beta vector stores, file batches that upload and pull. This allows us to upload a batch of files. And then this is kind of a helper function that uploads the files, attaches them to the vector store, and because this is all asynchronous, it pulls and waits for that to be complete before it returns a response. So it does all the polling for us here as well. So here we're uploading the files to this vector store, and these are the uploads that came from this form. Then the last step is to update our assistant we just created with this new vector store ID. So we're going to say OpenAI.beta.assistants.update. So we're updating our assistant. Here's the assistant we're updating, and we're saying for your tool resources, file search, vector store IDs, this is the vector store ID that we're attaching to you. And then the last thing, let's redirect to a page that shows some details about this assistant. So I'm going to go to a redirect to admin assistants/assistant ID, which is this route right here, admin assistants/ID. And it's just going to show us, congratulations, you've created an assistant with the ID that we just created it with. So quick overview. We create an instance of OpenAI. We create the assistant through the assistants.create function. We create a vector store and give it a name. we upload our files to the vector store, and then we attach that vector store to our assistant. Now we have an assistant. After this is done, we'll have an assistant. It'll have a vector store with files that it can search against. So let's go ahead and try to create this through the front end and see what happens. So here's our assistant. We're going to give it a name. We'll call it Finley. And I'm going to take the same prompt that I had before, which I put in a text file here. So you're a financial analyst. We're going to choose our files. I'm going to go to pull the Apple file and then say create assistant. And now in the background, this is calling the API to create the assistant, create the vector store, upload the documents, and then return with an assistant ID. So you can see it was successful. Here's the assistant ID. If I go back to our playground tab and refresh this, there's now this new assistant named Finley. You should see it'll have the same assistant ID ending in TH54. Yep, TH54. It has the instructions we provided. It has the vector store that we created with the file that we uploaded to it. And you could test it from here as well. But I just wanted to show you that it did actually create this assistant on our account, and it gave us an assistant ID, which I'm going to copy right now. So that's step one. We've created an assistant using the API, but we haven't added that assistant to our chatbot yet. So if I go back to our app and look at the Apple page, you can still see it still doesn't know it. We haven't done anything with this to tie it to that assistant. So what's going on here is this app is just a simple form. I type in this field and hit send. It makes an API call to a service on the back end. That API call has some simple logic to return a response to this chatbot. And what we're going to do is go to the API that this chatbot is calling and update it to use our new AI assistant. So let me close some of these things. On the back end, our chatbot is calling an API with the route of API assistant / ticker symbol. So if we're on the page for Apple, it's going to return AAPL. And then there's a backend service here that takes a post from that form. It gets the JSON from that post message, which is a user message. That user message is of type thread message. It just has two fields, a thread ID, which is a string or null, and then the content, which is what the user typed in that input box on the chatbot. Then it says if the thread ID is null, we're going to start a new thread just by creating a random one. And the logic here is very simple. It just looks to see if the content of that message includes hello or hi. If it does, it returns hello, how can I help you today? If the content includes stock price, then it calls a get stock price API and returns that, the return value of that API call to the chatbot. Same thing with earnings. And finally, if it doesn't find anything, it returns with the stock. I don't know that. What do you think I am in AI? So very simple, but not what we want. I'm just going to start deleting this old logic, and we're going to replace it with OpenAI. So the first thing we need to do is create our instance of OpenAI, just like we did before. I'm just going to copy that from here. So in our backend for the chatbot, I'm going to create an instance of the OpenAI class using the API key. And then we're going to call our assistant. So to do that, we need our assistant ID. going to go back to our playground and copy it here. This is the assistant we just created. Usually store this in a database or an environment variable, but for this I'm just going to hard code it. And then we created our instance of OpenAI. Then the next thing we need to do is, if the thread is null, we need to create a new thread. So going back to the Quick Start documentation, it walks you through creating a thread. So we're just going to copy this function. So if the thread was null, let's create a new thread. And instead of setting message.threadID to some random string, we're going to set it to the ID of the thread we just created. Now there's one more thing I want to do when I create this thread. When you create a thread, you can add some additional context. And our use case here, whenever you post a message to the back end, it's always in reference to a specific ticker symbol, because the chatbot shows up on a page for Apple or for Microsoft. So I want to tell this thread when it starts that any questions that aren't otherwise specified with a ticker symbol should default to this ticker symbol. So to do that, when I create the thread, I'm going to pass it a message. And that message is an object that has a role of user and some content. And the content is just something I'm going to hard code that just says, if not specified, questions in this thread will be about the ticker symbol ticker. So I'm creating a thread and I'm just giving it some context. It says, hey, if not specified, you can assume any question is about the ticker symbol that was passed in on this API call, which for our use case is going to be Apple. So after we've created the thread, next thing we need to do is create a message. So going back to our documentation, you can see here's how to add a message to that thread. I'm going to copy this, come back here and say, so I'm going to create a new message, and the thread ID is going to be the thread ID we put on this user message. So user message.threadID. The role is user, so this is a message from the user, and the content is going to be whatever the user sent from the chatbot. So I'll say user message.content, and that's it. That'll create a message and add it to our thread. The next step is to create a run. So if you remember from before, you create an assistant, you configure it, then you create a thread and you can add messages to it. Then you need to create a run for that assistant and that thread in order to get a response back. So coming back here, you can see here's how to create a thread. There's an example with streaming and without. For this webinar, we're doing the without just because it's a little bit simpler to explain. At the end, I'll show you an example with streaming. The difference is without streaming, what happens is we make a request to the AI. We wait for it to complete fully before it responds, and then we take that response all at the same time and send it to the front end. With streaming, OpenAI uses server-sent events to send you back the response as it's being generated. So you'll get word by word the response as it's being created, and it makes for a little bit better user experience. You're not waiting as long, and they'll see the response as it's coming. But like I said, for now we're just going to use without streaming. So I'm going to use this example of creating a run without streaming. So we're going to say run is openai.beta.threads.run.create and pull. So this helper method is going to create the run, and like I said, we have to wait for it to be completely done before we get a response. So it's going to pull for that response to be complete. And we're going to pass it our thread ID again, which is user message.thread ID. We're going to pass it our assistant ID. And then we don't need to send it any extra instructions. It just needs to look at the messages on the thread. So we've created our run. We get the response back. Then last thing we need to do is get the response from that run and return the messages that the assistant put on the thread. So this is an example of how to do that. So when the run comes back, if the status is completed, which is what we would expect here, we're going to get the list of messages for our thread, because when it's done, the AI will put another message on that thread, and it'll be actually the first message in that list is the newest, so it's the message from the assistant. The sample code is reversing all of the data and printing out in logs. It's not exactly what we want to do, so we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to say const message equals messages.data.0. So like I said, when the AI is done, it adds a message to our thread. The newest message is always the first, so we're going to pull the first message off of this data list, and that's the response from the AI. And then this isn't text, this is an object. We need to get the text from this, so we're going to say const message text is equal to, I'm going to copy what they did down here. I'm going to explain what this does. So this is the text value. And then finally, we're going to return some JSON. And the JSON is going to have a thread ID, which is the thread ID on the user message, and the message text that we got back from the assistant. Let me explain this real quick. This looks a little bit weird. So when we call this messages.list endpoint, if I look at the reference documentation, messages, list messages, it's going to return an object that looks like this. There's a data, and it's an array, and we're pulling the first message off that array. And then within this message object, there's a content of type text. So we want to get the text value from that content. So we're just doing a shortcut. We're saying data0 content.text.value. We're taking some shortcuts in our code here because we're only dealing with text. We're not dealing with any sort of images here. So in my code, I'm just saying, give me the content text value. That's the message that we're getting back from the AI. If we asked it to generate an image, we'd have to check the content type and make sure we're getting the right content type back. One more thing to do here. So if the status is not completed, right now it's probably going to be an error because we're not doing anything like function calling where we would have to follow up with another status call. So we're just going to say, hey, if it's not completed, let's just return a we're sorry. Something went wrong, please try again. So let's walk through this one more time. We created a variable to hold our assistant ID. With a typo in it. Let me fix that. We created an instance of our OpenAI client. If there was no thread ID on the message, we're creating a new thread. We're providing it with some context. Then we're adding the user message to our thread. Then we're creating a run for that thread and this assistant. And then once that run is done, if the status is completed, we're getting the first message from that list of messages. We're getting the text value of that, and we're returning that back to the chatbot. So this should all be working now. Let's go to our front end and test it out. Let's just say hello. So it's taking a little bit longer. That's a good sign. Hi, how can I assist you today? Do you need any specific information or analysis related to Apple? Let's ask who is on the board. All right, so I was able to find the board members, and it even tells us where it's founded, what page of the 10K it founded on. That's interesting. You can also do ask it some more vague questions like, what are the 3 biggest risks facing Apple? While it's thinking about that, I'm gonna find some more specific data in here that we can ask it about later. So let's see here. There's lots of charts in here. Oh, here's a table full of data. All right, so it did some analysis, and it gave you some details on supply chain risks, macroeconomic risks, and competitive risks facing Apple. Let's ask it a little bit something more specific here. This table has a bunch of figures in here showing net sales by reportable segment. So let's just ask, let's say we didn't know where this was. What are the net sales by reportable segment? This one's thinking a little bit more. All right, so it did give me the value, 162.6 billion, a decrease of 4% from the previous year. This is kind of interesting as well. You can see here this table makes it looks like these values are in like 162,560. But there's a note up here that says the dollars are in millions, so it knew to translate this to 162.6 billion. That's pretty good. So yeah, we've created an AI assistant using code. We've given it some context by uploading this documentation to it, and we've integrated it into an existing chatbot, but it doesn't have function calling yet. So if we wanted to get something like the stock price or the earnings per share, it wouldn't have that data because we haven't enabled those functions. So that's our next step. Let's add function calling to our API. To do that, we're going to go back to the code. I'm going to commit these changes. And I'm going to pull out a branch that I've already created that has some of this function calling in it. Okay, I've pulled down the branch that has function calling support in it. When you enable function calling for your application, there's 2 things you need to do. First is when you create the assistant, you need to tell the assistant that it supports function calling and define the functions that it supports. So I'm going to go back to our create assistant code that we did earlier. If you look here, when I create the assistant before, it kind of looked just like this. We said, here's the name, the instructions, your supporting file search, and here's your model. When we add function calling, there's a new parameter or tool that we set up for the assistant when we create it. And we're saying you also have a tool of type function. You can add multiple functions here. And then you define the function that is available. So this one, we're defining a function called get stock price last 30 days. Then we just give it a description. The AI will use this to determine if it needs to call this API or not. So this description says get the daily stock price for the last 30 days. Then you define the parameters that the function accepts. In this case, it takes an object with a property named ticker. The ticker is a string, and the string or the description of that field is the ticker symbol of the stock. And finally, you define which fields are required. So we're just saying the ticker symbol is required. So now that the AI knows about this function, if it needs to call the function, when we create a run, it'll return a status saying, hey, there's an action required. I want you to call this function. It's going to give me the exact parameters to call the function with based on this. We call the function and then return the data back to that run, and then it uses it to complete and eventually puts a message back on the thread. So let's go ahead and create this assistant with function calling. So going back here, I'll go back to admin, create assistant. I'm going to call it Finley with functions, and you are a financial analyst. I'm going to keep it simple for now. We're going to upload our document, create the assistant. This should just take a second. It'll give us our ID. All right, so here's our ID. I'm going to copy this. Go back to the playground just to make sure it created it successfully. Here's the Finley with functions. There's our vector store, and you can see here's the function that we defined. All right, so now I'm going to go back. The second thing you have to do is in the API call for the chatbot, it needs to support calling that function as well. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it our new assistant ID, the one that supports function calling. And everything else is the same. It's a post. If there's no thread ID, let's create a new thread. Let's add our message to that thread. Let's create our run. Now this is where things get different. We need to handle a response coming back from that run that says, call a function for me. So to do that, in this branch of the code, I created a handle run status function. If I jump to that, you can see this takes the run. It checks the status. If the status is completed, then this code is exactly the same as before. We're just getting the latest message from that thread and then returning an object that has the thread ID and the content, which is the message from the assistant. However, if the status is requires action, that means the assistant wants us to do something for it. Specifically, it wants us to call one of the functions that we defined. So I have another function here called handle requires action. This guy takes the run. It just does a check to make sure, yes, it is a requires action call, and they want us to submit tool outputs back to them. And it gave us a list of tool calls that it wants us to make. So if those things are true, then we need to loop through all the tool calls that the AI is asking us to make. In our case, there's only one because we only have one function, but we could have defined 10 functions and it might want us to call all of those. So this is a list of tool calls. And then we want to map the response of those into an output. And then we're going to take that output and we're going to send it back to the run so it has the data from that function call. So again, we're looping through all the tool calls. For each tool call, we're getting the function name. So if it told us the function name it wants us to call is get stock price last 30 days, then we get the arguments. These are, again, coming from AI. So we're getting the parameters we want to pass to that function, or that function. And then we're calling our get stock price data, which is the function we already had to get stock price data. We're passing it the parameters that it sent to us, which is that object with the ticker symbol in it. And we're getting the stock data back. And then the outputs that we're returning to the AI is this an object with a tool call ID, and the output, which is a stringified version of this stock data, which is the stock data for the last 30 days. So, and that's all getting mapped into this output promises. We're resolving those promises here. And then we're calling openai.beta.threads.run.submit tool outputs and poll. So for this thread ID, this run ID, here's all the outputs that for the functions you asked us to call. And then once that's done, we're going to handle the status again. This time, hopefully it's complete. If not, it may ask us to call another function. So we may go through this loop again. But if it is complete, then we pull the message back and return it to the front end. So let's try this out, fingers crossed. We're going to go back to our main app, go to Apple, and let's say, what is the current stock price? So this should be going through the loop behind the scenes, returning a response to us, asking us to call a function, and thus returning that data. Most recent closing stock price for Apple is $227.58 as of September 27th, 2024. If we go back to our code running and look at the output of the server, we can see this log statement that we added that says tool output submitted successfully was ran. So that does mean we did generate responses and successfully send them back to OpenAI. So that's an example of function calling. So we've created the assistant and we've implemented function calling. Real quick, I just wanted to show an example using streaming. Again, I already have a branch that has this enabled. Oops. Let me roll this back. Check out our streaming branch. I'm going to switch the assistant ID to the one we just created. Oops, not that. The assistant ID. I'm just going to show you the difference from a user perspective of the streaming API. Let's just say hello. You can see how it didn't wait for the whole response. It returned as it was generating. Let's ask who is on the board. And now you can see it's returning the data as it's generating it instead of waiting for a full response. Probably another video to walk through the code for that. But in a nutshell, it's using server sent events to send these updates as it's generating the response. All right. So that brings us to the end of the live demo. All right, so in the last 30 minutes or so, we've created an AI assistant, implemented file search, added function calling, and integrated it into an existing application. That's just kind of scratching the surface with what you can do with OpenAI. There's a bunch of other features that we didn't get a chance to talk about or even look at. Here's a few examples. One is image input and image creation. You can upload images to the newer models. The models are then able to describe the images. It can even compare two images, looking for differences, or you can use DALL-E 3 to create images for you. It has a really powerful speech to text and text to speech APIs. There's the ability to do video transcription, where you can upload a video and get the text of the video returned. It's good at translation, so you can translate from one language to another. There's a new concept of batch completions. So if you don't need a response in real time, but you want to have a large number of tasks you want the AI to do, you can use their batch completions endpoint. It's 50% cheaper, and you can send it a large number of tasks that it might do overnight. And then there's the ability to fine-tune models. So if file search and prompt engineering aren't enough to get the model to do exactly what you want, there's other ways of fine-tuning it to behave how you prefer. And I just wanted to end with this quote from Paul Graham. Paul is an entrepreneur, and he's the founder of Y Combinator, which is probably the most successful startup incubator in the world. He recently tweeted out, multiple speakers at startup school made the same very interesting point. If you start a startup now to do something that barely works with AI, the next models will make it really work. And this may seem obvious, but I think it's worth calling out that as we start to build applications that leverage AI, even if they're not perfect now, as the new models come out, our software will automatically become more powerful and more accurate and more useful. So I guess start building now and watch your applications become even more powerful as new models come out. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you got some useful information from this. At Sketch Development, we provide custom software, DevOps, and coaching solutions. So if you're thinking about a new project, or if you need help with an existing one, we'd love to talk with you to see how we can help. And you can reach us at our email, info@sketchdev.io. And thanks again.